It is December the 9th, 1968, and a man named Douglas Engelbart is standing on a stage at Brooks Hall inside the San Francisco Civic Auditorium, facing an audience of roughly 1,000 computer engineers who have come to the Fall Joint Computer Conference expecting the usual procession of papers and slides. What they get instead is 90 minutes that none of them will forget. Engelbart sits behind a custom console, and under his right hand rests a small wooden block, about the size of a deck of cards, with a cord trailing out the back like a tail. He moves the block across the desk, and on the projection screen above the stage, a cursor follows it. He clicks a button on top of the block, and text appears. He clicks again, and a word leaps to a new position. No one in the room has ever seen a human being point at a computer before. Over the next hour and a half, Engelbart demonstrates hypertext linking, real-time collaborative editing, and live video conferencing with his team, operating the system from Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, 30 miles to the south. His engineer, Bill English, has built the entire audio and video link from scratch, connecting a terminal at the auditorium to the host computer at the lab. The audience watches a man navigate a computer the way a hand navigates a desk, reaching for things, moving them, placing them where they belong. The wooden block under his palm has two small metal wheels set at right angles on its underside and a single button on top. Someone at the lab called it a mouse because of the tail, and the name stuck. That demonstration will later be called the mother of all demos. The device under his hand will take another 15 years to reach an ordinary desk, and the man showing it to the world will never earn $1 from the billion that followed. You're watching Digital Relics, where we trace the machines that reshaped everyday life all the way back to the first crude version and the people who built it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the origin of the computer mouse is stranger and sadder than you think. Before the mouse, a computer only understood a keyboard. If you wanted to tell a machine what to do in the 1950s or 60s, you typed a command, letter by letter, into a terminal, and the machine typed back. There was no pointing, no dragging, no cursor drifting across a screen. The closest thing was a light pen, a device you held up to a cathode ray tube and pressed against the glass to select a point on the display. It worked, but it meant holding your arm in the air, aimed at a vertical screen, for as long as you needed to interact. Anyone who has held a paintbrush above shoulder height for 10 minutes knows why that solution did not last. The deeper problem was a mismatch between the human mind and the machines it had built. People think spatially. They reach for things. They point at what they want. They arrange objects on a surface and remember where they put them. Computers in the 1960s offered none of that. They were text in, text out, and every instruction required you to remember the correct command in the correct syntax. The gap was not mechanical, it was cognitive, and almost nobody was working on closing it. Douglas Engelbart was. He was born on January the 30th, 1925, in Portland, Oregon, the son of a radio repairman. He studied electrical engineering at Oregon State, and during the war, the Navy sent him to the Philippines as a radar technician. On the island of Leyte, in a Red Cross library built from bamboo and tin, he picked up a copy of The Atlantic and read an article that would redirect the course of his life. The article was As We May Think by Vannevar Bush, published in 1945, and it described a theoretical desk-sized machine called a Memex that could store and link a person's entire library of knowledge. Bush imagined a future in which information could be navigated by association rather than by index, the way a mind actually moves when it thinks. Engelbart carried that idea through a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, completed in 1955, and into Stanford Research Institute, which he joined in 1957. He founded the Augmentation Research Center with a single purpose: not to replace human thinking with a computer, but to extend it. He wanted a machine that could keep up with the way a mind actually works, leaping between ideas, linking one thought to another, pointing at the thing that matters. The keyboard could not do that alone. He needed something for the hand. In the early 1960s, he began sketching an idea for a small device with two perpendicular wheels that could translate the motion of a palm across a desk into the motion of a cursor on a screen. In 1964, Bill English, the first and at that time the only engineer in Engelbart's lab, built the first working prototype from those sketches. The housing was a hand-carved wooden shell, roughly twice the height of a modern mouse. Inside sat two thin metal disc wheels positioned at right angles, each making direct contact with the desk surface. One wheel tracked horizontal movement, the other tracked vertical. A single button sat on top, and the cord came out the back. No one can remember who first called it a mouse. Engelbart himself said the name simply appeared, and no one bothered to change it. It started that way, he told interviewers years later, and we never did change it. The word appeared nowhere in the official documentation. When Engelbart filed for the patent on June 27, 1967, the device was registered as an XY position indicator for a display system, patent number 3041-541. The patent was granted on November 17, 1970, and it belonged not to Engelbart or English, but to Stanford Research Institute. Before the patent was even filed, English led a 1966 study, funded by NASA, to compare the mouse against every other pointing device available: the light pen, the trackball, a joystick, and a slider mounted on a pivot. The mouse won in every category, even though none of the test subjects had ever used one before. It was faster, more accurate, and easier to learn than everything the industry already had. That study should have been the starting gun for commercialization. It was not. The mouse had won the test and had no market to enter because the computers it could point at did not yet exist. But Douglas Engelbart was not the only engineer who saw the problem. 6,000 miles east of Menlo Park, in a Telefunken laboratory in the West German city of Konstanz, an engineer named Rainer Malebranche was working on the same problem from the opposite direction. Instead of wheels touching the desk, Malebranche proposed inverting a trackball by placing a small rolling ball on the underside of a handheld device, with friction wheels inside the housing to track the ball's motion. The design was simpler and smoother than Engelbart's perpendicular wheels, and Telefunken published it in their company journal on October 2, 1968, 2 months before Engelbart's December demonstration in San Francisco. The device was called the Rollkugel, the rolling ball, and its model designation was the RKS 186. Here is where honest history requires a flag. Engelbart's wheel-based mouse came first as a working prototype, and English built it years before the Rollkugel appeared in print. But the ball mechanism that Malebranche developed in Konstanz is the one that would actually dominate mouse design for the next quarter century. Engelbart invented the mouse. Malebranche invented the version of it that the world used. Telefunken, remarkably, never patented the Rollkugel. The first commercial installation of the device arrived at Munich's Leibniz Computing Center in 1972, a year before the Xerox Alto, making it, by some accounts, the first mouse ever sold. Meanwhile, back in California, Engelbart's Augmentation Research Center was slowly losing its lifeline. Government funding through ARPA began shifting to other projects, and the lab's budget shrank. One by one, his best researchers left for better-funded positions elsewhere. The most consequential departure was Bill English, who walked out of Stanford Research Institute in 1971 and joined Xerox PARC, the newly founded research center in Palo Alto that was attracting the best minds in computer science. English took everything he had learned about the mouse with him. What he left behind was a patent owned by an institution that did not understand what it held, an inventor with a shrinking team, and a device that had beaten every rival in a controlled test and convinced no buyer to write a check. Engelbart had built the future of human-computer interaction in a room that was emptying out around him. He went back to work, At Xerox PARC, Bill English did something Engelbart had never had the resources to attempt. He threw away the wheels. Working from the same ball and housing principle as Malibran's Rollkugel, English developed a new mouse for PARC's most ambitious project, a machine called the Alto, designed principally by Charles Thacker and conceived by Butler Lampson, that would become the first computer to put a mouse-driven graphical interface on a screen. The Xerox Alto launched on March 1st, 1973. It had a 3-button mouse, a bitmap display, overlapping windows, and icons you could click. It was, by any honest measure, the first personal computer in the modern sense of the word. Xerox built roughly 2,000 Altos over the next decade. They sent some to universities and research labs and kept the rest inside the company. They never sold a single unit to the public. The most important computer of the 1970s existed behind closed doors, and the most important input device of the 20th century sat on desks that only Xerox employees and a handful of academics ever used. Then, in December of 1979, Steve Jobs walked into Xerox PARC. The visit was not a theft. Xerox had agreed to it in exchange for the right to purchase 100,000 shares of Apple stock before the company's initial public offering. Jobs was shown the Alto's mouse-driven interface, the WYSIWYG text editing, the icons and overlapping windows. He saw, in the course of a single visit, the shape of everything Apple would build for the next decade. But Jobs did not take the Xerox mouse. He took the idea of a mouse and handed it to 2 young Stanford engineers named Dean Hovey and David Kelly, who ran a small design consultancy called Hovey-Kelly Design. Jobs told them he wanted a mouse that could be manufactured for somewhere between $10 and $35. The existing Xerox mouse cost around $400 and jammed constantly. Hovey went home that weekend, walked into a Walgreens, bought a band roll-on deodorant stick, pried out the rolling ball, dropped it into a plastic butter dish, and wired a crude sensor underneath. That prototype, a deodorant ball rolling inside a butter dish on a kitchen table in Palo Alto, is the direct ancestor of every mouse that shipped with a Macintosh. The team tested the 3-button layout from the Xerox mouse and found that ordinary users could not remember which button did what. They cut it to 1. Jim Sachs designed the optical encoder system using rollers, LEDs, and phototransistors. Jim Yurchenko designed the internal structure, a plastic ribcage that held the optics and electronics in precise alignment and could be injection molded by the million. The mouse that would bring pointing to the mass market was being shaped in a small studio, while Xerox still had not figured out how to sell the computer the idea came from. The forces that carried the mouse from laboratory prototype to every desk on Earth arrived in rapid succession, and they were not gentle to the machines that came first. The IBM personal computer launched in August of 1981 and conquered the office with a keyboard and a blinking cursor. No mouse required. 3 months earlier, on April the 27th, Xerox had shipped the Star 8010, the first commercial computer with a mouse-driven graphical interface. The Star had a 2-button mouse, icons, folders, a desktop metaphor, Ethernet networking, and a laser printer. Every one of those ideas would become standard in every computer built afterward. A single Star workstation cost roughly $16,000, and a complete system with server and printer ran close to $75,000. Xerox sold approximately 25,000 units. The Star proved that the graphical interface worked. It also proved that the market would not pay a small fortune for a desktop computer, no matter how good the engineering inside it was. Apple tried next. The Lisa launched in January of 1983 at $9,995. It had a mouse, a graphical interface, and a price that put it beyond the reach of nearly everyone who wanted one. It failed. That same year, Microsoft shipped its first mouse, a 2-button device with green buttons and a steel ball, manufactured by Alps Electric in Japan, priced at $195 and bundled with a copy of Microsoft Word. Across the Atlantic, Logitech, Founded on October 2nd, 1981, in the Swiss village of Apples by Daniel Borel, Pierluigi Zappacosta, and Giacomo Marini, had already shipped the P4 mouse in 1982, built on a design by Swiss inventor Jean-Daniel Nicud. By 1984, Logitech had secured an OEM contract to manufacture mice for Hewlett-Packard at a new factory in Fremont, California. The numbers told the story of a technology racing toward a price the world could pay. The Xerox Star mouse sat atop a $16,000 machine. The Microsoft mouse cost $195 on its own. The Apple mouse that Hovey's team designed could be stamped out for under $35. And Douglas Engelbart's patent, number 3241-541, expired in 1987, 17 years after it was granted, and precisely at the moment the mouse market was about to explode. Stanford Research Institute had licensed the patent to Apple for, by Engelbart's own account, something like $40,000. The man who invented the computer mouse received nothing. On January the 22nd, 1984, during the third quarter of Super Bowl XIX, Apple aired a 60-second television advertisement directed by Ridley Scott. 2 days later, on January the 24th, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage at the Flint Center in Cupertino and introduced the Macintosh. It cost $2,495. It had a 9-inch monochrome screen, and tucked beside every unit was a small beige mouse, with a single button and a rubber ball on its underside. The Macintosh was not the first computer to ship with a mouse. The Star had done it 3 years earlier, the Lisa 1 year before, but the Macintosh was the first computer with a mouse that an ordinary person could afford, and the single-button design meant an ordinary hand could understand it without being taught. Though Apple included a cassette-based tutorial anyway, because in 1984 most people had never touched one. By May the 3rd of that year, Apple had sold 70,000 Macintosh units. The mouse had crossed from the laboratory to the living room. The Xerox Star 8 Hours 10 deserves a moment of silence from anyone who cares about engineering. It shipped on April the 27th, 1981, with a 2-button mouse, a bitmap display, the desktop metaphor of files and folders and trash cans, Ethernet networking, and a laser printer. Every idea inside the Star would outlive the machine itself by decades. A single workstation cost more than many American workers earned in a year, and Xerox sold only about 25,000 before pulling the line. The Star invented the modern desktop, and the market could not afford to notice. The few surviving units sit in museums now, and a working Star system, if one ever surfaces at auction, commands prices that reflect what the engineers who built it always knew. They were right, and they were early, and in technology, the distance between those two things is often fatal. The Macintosh was the proof that the Star could never deliver, that a mouse-driven computer was not a luxury for researchers, but a tool for everyone, provided the price fell below the threshold of pain. The single button was the key. Dean Hovey's team had watched users fumble with 3 buttons on the Xerox mouse, unsure which press would do what. One button meant one answer. Click. The ball rolled inside Jim Yurchenko's injection-molded ribcage, spinning 2 rollers connected to optical encoders that Jim Sachs had designed, translating the motion of a wrist into the motion of an arrow on a screen. The feel of that first Macintosh mouse, the weight of it in the hand, the slight resistance of the ball against the desk, the certainty of the single click, became the tactile signature of a generation. For millions of people, the Macintosh mouse was the first time a computer felt like it was listening. The mouse was not finished evolving. By the mid-1990s, the device had conquered every desk in every office, and the remaining question was not whether people would use one, but what else it could learn to do. The answer came from an unlikely corner of Microsoft. Eric Michelman, a group program manager on the Excel team, wanted a faster way to scroll through large spreadsheets. He built a crude prototype by mounting a small wheel from a disassembled joystick between the two buttons of a standard mouse. The hardware team, led by Kabir Siddiqui, made the wheel clickable. Carol Clement managed the project through to production. Microsoft announced the IntelliMouse on July the 22nd, 1996, at a retail price of $85. The Word team had argued for scrolling. The Excel team had argued for zooming. The compromise, scroll by default and zoom with the control key held, is still the way every computer in the world works 30 years later. Within a year of launch, the scroll wheel was so plainly correct that every major manufacturer copied it. 3 years after that, in 1999, Microsoft shipped the IntelliMouse Explorer, and the ball disappeared for good. An optical sensor replaced the rubber ball and the mechanical rollers, with a tiny camera and a beam of light tracking the surface beneath the mouse at hundreds of frames per second. The last moving part was gone. The device that Douglas Engelbart had built from wood and metal wheels in a California workshop in 1964 had become a sealed shell of plastic and light, and it sat on desks that numbered in the hundreds of millions. The mouse had taken the command line. It had taken the light pen. It had taken the joystick and the trackball and the keyboard shortcut, and it had replaced them all with a single motion of the wrist. It had reached its fullest form, but the screen it pointed at was already learning to feel a finger. The successor did not arrive as a replacement. It arrived as a fingertip. Laptop computers had shipped with trackpads since the early 1990s, small rectangular surfaces that turned a sliding finger into a moving cursor. They worked well enough for email and web browsing, and most professionals kept a mouse plugged in beside them for anything that required precision. The real shift came on June the 29th, 2007, when Apple shipped the iPhone. The screen was the input device. There was no mouse, no stylus, no trackball. You touched the thing you wanted and it responded. 3 years later, the iPad extended the same idea to a surface the size of a notebook. In July of 2010, Apple released the Magic Trackpad, a standalone glass rectangle that brought multi-touch gestures to the desktop and invited every Mac user to consider a life without a mouse beside the keyboard. The generational arithmetic was stark. In the mid-2000s, global PC shipments exceeded 300 million units per year, and nearly every one of those machines shipped with a mouse or depended on one. By the middle of the 2010s, smartphones outsold personal computers by a factor of roughly 5 to 1. A generation learned to swipe before it learned to click. Tablets and phones had no need for a mouse, and the laptop trackpad had grown precise enough that many users stopped reaching for one. Desktop PC shipments entered a slow decline that has not reversed. You can read this transition two ways, and honest history holds both at once. The touchscreen did to the mouse what the mouse had done to the command line. It removed the intermediary between the hand and the screen. A finger is the oldest pointing device in existence, but the touchscreen replaced the mouse only in contexts where a tap is enough, and a pixel-accurate selection is not required. A surgeon marking a scan, an architect drawing a wall to the millimeter, a competitive gamer tracking a target at 400 dots per inch. None of them can do what they do with a fingertip on glass. The mouse retreated from the center of computing. It did not leave the room. What happened next was not extinction, but specialization. The mouse stopped being the universal way to talk to a computer and became the superior way to do the things that nothing else could do as well. The gaming market claimed it first. By the early 2020s, the gaming mouse had become an object of obsessive engineering, with adjustable weight cartridges, optical sensors polling at 8,000 Hz, microswitches rated for 80 million clicks, wireless connections with latency below a single millisecond. The Razer Death Adder alone surpassed 10 million units sold. Professional designers, video editors, surgeons, and audio engineers kept mice on their desks for the same reason a carpenter keeps a handplane beside a power sander. It held the crosshair steady on a scan. It held the line true on a blueprint. It held the cut on a single frame and the anchor on a curve, and no glass surface under a fingertip could hold any of them as well. The contrast pairs, laid end to end, describe the full arc of a device born in a research lab and grown until it outran the world's ability to count it. The first mouse was a block of carved wood that cost nothing to build because it was a prototype with no market. The Microsoft mouse in 1983 cost $195. The Macintosh mouse in 1984 came inside a $2,495 box. The IntelliMouse in 1996 cost $85. A high-end wireless gaming mouse in the 2020s costs $150 or more and weighs less than 60 grams. In December of 2008, Logitech shipped its 1 billionth mouse. One manufacturer, 1 billion units. And Logitech was far from the only company building them. The originals are still out there. The Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, holds several of the mice built at Stanford Research Institute in the 1960s, behind glass where visitors can see the wooden shells, the metal wheels, and the cord that gave the device its name. A replica of Engelbart's first prototype sits in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. In March of 2023, an original Engelbart mouse and coding key set from the lab went to auction at RRA Auction in Boston. The lot sold for $178,936, 40 times the pre-sale estimate, setting the world record for a computer mouse. A previous Engelbart mouse had sold at the same auction house in December of 2020 for $34,479, and another in March of 2022 for $45,935. The prices climb because the supply will never grow. There are only so many of those wooden shells left in the world, and every year the people who remember what they meant are fewer. Across the internet, enthusiast communities catalog every sensor revision, every shell geometry, every switch actuation curve. Collectors pay thousands for early Microsoft mice with the green buttons and the steel ball, for Xerox PARC optical prototypes, for Logitech P4 units still sealed in original packaging. The function of the mouse, the translation of a hand's motion into a cursor's motion, now lives inside every laptop trackpad, every touchscreen gesture library, every pointer event on every screen on Earth. The object may slowly recede. The idea cannot. That wooden block. Bill English carved the housing in a workshop at Stanford Research Institute in 1964, working from sketches that Douglas Engelbart had drawn after years of imagining a device that could close the gap between the human hand and the computer screen. 2 wheels, a cord, a single button. The patent belonged to Stanford Research Institute, not to the man who drew the sketches. The licensing fee they eventually collected would not have covered a single engineer's annual salary, and the patent itself expired in 1987, the precise year the market it had made possible finally came to life. Douglas Engelbart never received a cent in royalties from the device he had invented. He was awarded the Turing Award in 1997. He received the National Medal of Technology from President Clinton in the year 2000. He died on July 2, 2013 in Atherton, California, at the age of 88 from kidney failure. Bill English, the man who built the first prototype, who proved in a NASA-funded study that the mouse was the best pointing device ever tested, who engineered the 30-mile audio-visual link that made the mother of all demos possible, and who then walked to Xerox PARC and invented the ball mouse that the world actually used for 25 years, died on July 26, 2020, in San Rafael, California, at 91. Most of his obituaries had to explain who he was. The wooden block that started everything, or one very like it, sold at auction for more money than its inventor ever earned from his idea. The idea inside it now ships free with every computer on Earth. Douglas Engelbart invented the mouse to extend the reach of the human mind, and the world built 1 billion of them and never paid him for the idea. If you remember the first time you used a mouse, The click and the drag and the sudden feeling that the screen was finally listening to your hand, drop a comment below. Tell us the computer, the year, and whether it changed the way you worked. The people who rolled those early balls and clicked those single buttons know more about what the mouse meant than any spec sheet ever written. Subscribe to Digital Relics because we have the origin of another everyday machine coming next, and you will not want to miss where it began.